Okay, we are recording. I'm Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And I'm joined by Hannah Kim, who is an Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Thanks so much for joining me, Hannah.
Thanks for having me here.
Okay, so we're talking about true crime, the genre of true crime. And you work in the aesthetics of fiction. And so with true crime, I feel like it has some elements in common with traditional fictional forms, be they, literature and film. And so I guess we'll start with the question of the relationship between truth and fiction and how that relates to the relationship between fiction and nonfiction. So can you just get us started on those distinctions, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean, big questions that like literally my dissertation tried to answer in part. Yeah, I mean, true crime has been huge. My sister binge watches true like victim shows all the time. And yeah, I would consider true crime the umbrella category to be creative nonfiction. So you're right, and that they have a lot of kind of formal similarities to works that we would call fictional literature. So the kind of narrative style or the plot or the way they introduce characters feels very much like the kinds of movies we would watch under fiction, but the content is supposed to be based on true real life events. And so I think creative nonfiction is like this new genre that's getting really big. So think about memoirs that have a lot of novelistic techniques that is under nonfiction. It's really interesting because I was talking to a friend who teaches writing, and he told me that nonfiction actually doesn't have to do with what happened per se, but if you write something as you genuinely remember it, that's good enough to be considered nonfiction. And so in some ways, what actually happened or history could come apart from nonfiction. But for the most part, when it comes to true crimes, these are documented crimes that we can find records for that have been just told in these artistic and entertaining ways. And they've been so popular the past maybe 5-10 years.
Awesome. So how does true crime relate to, so when I think of true crime, I think about fictionalized versions of real events, right? True crime is supposed to be documentary, right? It's supposed to be about the real world and generating facts about the real world or making revelations about how things actually happened. How does it relate to fictionalized versions of true events, right? Thinking about books or movies or TV shows that are based on or inspired by true stories. I think there are some technical distinctions there. So could you go into those?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so in a really trivial sense, all works might be based on true stories in the sense that any work has to draw from real life experience, right? So even novels, not trying to be true in any sense, draws from the author's experience. But like, that's not what we're talking about. We mean something more robustly related to real life. And so I've learned that there are actually 4 different types of true story scripts. And so I have a friend who works in Hollywood, and he told me these are like legally loaded terms. So, when you watch a movie and it says based on a true story or inspired by true events, these are really loaded terms that demarcate the levels of inspiration that the story or the work drew from real lives. So there are like 4 different levels here. The version that's closest to reality is supposed to be based on a true story. So according to that category, most of the characters and plots and scenes are actually from documented events. So Schindler's List is an example of this category. Lincoln, or biopics in general, is like that. 127 Hours was based on a true accident, and Apollo 13 might be another instance where a lot of the characters and plots are actually drawn from real life. One tier down on this level is inspired by a true story. So in that sense, you actually work with a known character, with a known plot or events, but you mold the narrative order, I suppose, in a way that's aesthetically and entertainingly best. And so Pursuit of Happiness apparently is a work that falls in this category. And then we get based on true events. And I think historical fiction is a good way to think about this, where it's loosely based on some events that we know to be true, but the characters might be totally fictional. So Titanic is a good example of this. It really did sink, but the DiCaprio character didn't exist as we know it. There was no, super expensive jewelry, right? And so that's one thing. And then last, the most loosely inspired by category is inspired by true events. And so this can be as loosely correlated as events or characters that are just inspired by a particular place or an event. So Top Gun apparently is an example of this. And so there are like really robust distinctions going on here between different kinds of nonfiction or like true story works. And I think that's really fascinating that we do this, both for legal reasons, of course, but also philosophical reasons.
Right. And I guess the legal distinctions matter for basically getting sued by the people depicted, right? That if it's based on a true story and then someone depicted is like, this totally misrepresents me. And so it's a form of slander or libel, I guess, if it's written. And so then it becomes, you're open to a lawsuit if you say based on a true story and then you wildly misrepresent something. Whereas if you say, inspired by a true story or inspired by a true event, right, then you have much more freedom to mess around with those elements. And, someone may feel hurt by, your depiction of a character that's at least in part and perhaps loosely based on them. But they're less likely to sue just because, it's this category, not this more rigid, more rigidly true or supposed to be more religiously based on the truth than this lesser category, the inspired by category.
Yeah, and I think that's right. There's just less care that you might have to put in. And although I hesitated saying that because this happens in fictional works too, where in works of fiction, if you have a character who is identifiable as a particular person, I think that is enough grounds to sue for libel as well. And so it's like, it's the fiction nonfiction distinction doesn't get you out of the legal liability per se, which is interesting. But yet we still make these distinctions. So the question is, why is that? Is it what more is there that we're trying to get to with these distinctions beyond the legality of libel suits and such? And so I think those are really thought-provoking.
Yeah, and so how should we think of the distinction between fiction and nonfiction? I mean, that's a really big question, and a lot of philosophers have had a lot to say about it. But how do you think, or you could sort of skim over how some other people have thought about it if you want to. But how should we think about that distinction between fiction and nonfiction?
Yeah. So I'm going to run through the different kinds of attempts that have been made to draw this distinction using style or content or grammar or intention, history. I'll get to that. But before I run the list, I just want to motivate the issue of why do we even care about the fiction nonfiction distinction, right? Because there are philosophers who say this is not important. So for instance, Derek Matravers argues that the fiction nonfiction distinction is actually not that important or interesting, because what's more important is this separation between what he calls representation and confrontation, where representation is a series of events that are presented to you that are not in the here and now. So it's stuff that you can't act on. So traditional fictions, stories would be representation because you can't go save Anna Karenina, right? But also nonfiction historical works are also representation because you can't go and change history. Confrontation, on the other side, he thinks, is representation that invites direct action. So if I tell you oh, ball's on the way, look out, and then you're supposed to duck, that's a kind of confrontation, even though it's a kind of confrontation, because even though I'm giving you a representation of some states of affairs, you're asked to work with it. And so that's one way in which people try to argue the fiction nonfiction distinction doesn't matter. Surprisingly, Ken Walton also doesn't try to define fiction away from nonfiction. He thinks the line just can't be drawn. It's like too messy. And so I think that's why he focuses on works of fiction or fictional content and talk about make-believe and what we're invited to do instead of trying to like define it. I think both of these points are really good. But even so, I think the fiction nonfiction distinction should be discussed, if even if it's only so we can defend history. So for instance, there's a historian named Hayden White who became notorious for arguing that history is just as fictional as narrative fictions, like the ones written by novelists. And so his whole point was that people who live their lives in these historical events that recount, they didn't have this beginning, middle, and end. And so for instance, like people living through the American Revolution, like they didn't know like they were going to be living through the seminal time and the French Revolution. People didn't know that there was going to be these marked periods that like historians later analyze. And so he thinks history is about retroactively imposing all this structure on stuff that's more amorphous and messy. And that's exactly what goes on with fiction writing, where it's about coming up with a plot that is neat and you're giving structure to it. So he thinks history is fiction just as much as novels. And it's even like postmodern, right? Like there is no truth, it's all angles, interpretation. Like I think that's really dangerous because you can see where this gets into alternative facts and fake news really fast. And so, of course, historiography is complex. Winners write history, yes, and yes, it's not totally objective. And but I think we need to separate history from fiction as we know it. And I'm hoping that thinking about the fiction, nonfiction distinction can at least like help us separate those two things. And so with that said, how do we go about drawing the line? Well, one thing we know is that we can't draw the line along semantic lines or even syntactic lines, meaning the words mean the same, whether it's in a nonfiction work or fiction work. Grammar works pretty much the same. When we watch movies, whether it's a biopic of true events or totally fictional, like the way it's presented on the screen is going to be the same, right? So it's not going to be semantic or syntactic. Although with written fiction, free indirect discourse is a really interesting potential wrinkle. So this is a grammatical device where the narrator will speak in an omniscient third person point of view, but they will give you like a very personal first person content. And so people think that's something that can only happen in fiction. So that's like a potential grammatical device that could help us distinguish between fiction and nonfiction. But I get nervous about that line only because there's an instance of free and direct discourse because of the content that's surrounding, right? So for instance, that there's something fishy going on because, wait, this is omniscient narrating, but like, why is it talking about some like personal attitude of a character, right? And so you already need to have judged the work to be fiction to know that this is free indirect discourse going on and not something else. And so that gets me to the next potential way we can draw the fiction nonfiction distinction, which is content. So you might think that if it talks about impossible content, then it's fiction. So if we talk about antimatter in Dan Brown novels, we talk about time travel, this has to be all fiction. I guess one thought I have about that is how do we distinguish between nonfiction works that are just mistaken from fiction works that are giving you impossible events? Also, along those lines, I don't like using imagination versus belief as a way to distinguish fiction from nonfiction. So an intuitive view is if a work is asking you to imagine all these things and not believe it, that's fiction. And if it's asking you to believe what's said, that's nonfiction, so think about textbooks. And so I get why that's intuitive, but people have shown over and over that imagination is also called for when we work with nonfiction works, especially creative nonfiction works. So for instance, you're watching documentary, and if they have a staged actors, like acting out some scene, that's a fictional element that is asking you to imagine how the event went down. And so imagination can't be the thing that separates fiction from nonfiction. Author intention is always something that comes up. So like, why can't we just ask the author or just, like know what the intention was? And philosophers and literary critics have traditionally pushed back against this. So there's the intentional fallacy, which is something literature folks talk about, where if the intention didn't come across successfully, it doesn't matter because it's just a failure of a work. And if it did come across successfully, then it's redundant because we already know what the intention was. And philosophers don't like it because we don't know what intention is, right? And also, what is this ghostly mental thing that we're supposed to go hunt for, right? To know the status of the work, and we don't like that. And so some philosophers have tried to argue that you don't need this mental ghostly thing to get to intention, because usually we just look at people and see what they do to figure out what you intend, right? So for instance, if you like raise your finger right now, I'm gonna like guess that you intend to interrupt me because I've been going on for a while, right? And so we read intentions off of actions. And so we might be able to do that with works as well. And so, I mean, I hope to just have shown you that there are different ways to try to slice the fiction nonfiction distinction. Not, I think all of these have like wrinkles and like fuzzy cases that needs to be dealt with. Although I will kind of mention my own favorite way of trying to draw this distinction, which is just to ask whether it's relevant that the work is veracious or not. So what I mean is veracity relevant to the work? So in a work of fiction, if something, unless it's trying to be historical fiction, right? In a work of fiction, if it ends up getting some fact wrong, like that is not a detraction from a work. Or sorry, let me rephrase that. In a work of fiction, the fact that some made up character event didn't actually happen that way, or they don't exist, is not a detraction from a work. Whereas in a nonfiction, veracity is relevant, because if things didn't go down the way it's described, then it is a dent in the work. Historical fiction gets complicated, as you can imagine, but this is just a way of trying to approach the fiction nonfiction distinction through the lens of rhetoric, talking about what's relevant or what's appropriate to a work. And so this is stuff that comes out of Richard Walsh's work that I really like. So that might be one way to go about it. I think it's more promising.
Yeah, that's interesting. And with true crime in particular, it's supposed to be, not merely have sort of the form of documentary, right? And especially when we're thinking about film and television, right, where there is a sort of documentary thing. But with true crime, it's meant to be journalistic, right? That it's uncovering something. And so, the seminal example or a seminal example of true crime is Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, right? Which has, exactly as you're saying, the veracity matters. And he apparently, allegedly, took a lot of liberties with the truth in order to fit a more traditional narrative form. Or, other examples, like Errol Morris's documentary, Thin Blue Line, or the Jinx or Making a Murderer, those documentary series on HBO Max and Netflix respectively, or podcasts. There are so many true crime podcasts, sort of Serial being I think from 2016, 2014, sort of the big one, right? The one that sort of kicked off the murder shows and true crime thing. And there, the veracity really does matter, right? That if you're taking a lot of liberties with the truth, it's, because it's supposed to be journalistic, there's a certain code of conduct and ethics having to do with the integrity of journalism. And the truth really does matter. If you're acting fast and loose with the truth, you're doing something wrong in a way that if you're working in historical fiction or something, you're able to do that. You have way more freedom to sort of play with what happened in order to, have a more satisfying narrative or something of that sort.
Right. Yeah. And so I think you're totally right. Like true crime is beholden to the facts that are known. And so these are almost like these skeletal structures that they have to like keep. And it's all the window dressing and the way they paint it and the way they like reveal it to you that they have a lot of control over. But I think the very fact that veracity matters might be why, might be one reason why it's been so popular, because there's a sense that because it's based on reality, it's just more meaningful or like more impactful. So for instance, like it's funny because my mom like refuses to read fictional works because she thinks like it's kind of like frivolous, like it's all made up. Like, why does it matter? But she reads a lot of nonfiction works because she likes to read, but I guess she wants to feel like she's reading stuff that like is substantive. And I wonder if that's like implicitly playing a role in people's mind where like, yes, this is entertainment, but it's also like current events, right? There's also history. And I'm sure that also like plays like a aesthetic and phenomenological role where not only is this like so wild, but it could have happened to me in some sense, right? That's really adding to the stakes almost. And so I think that veracity part of true crime partly explains the appeal and the popularity. I mean, and I think related to that, it's just like the few true crime shows I've seen, I usually find them too anxiety inducing. So I stay away, but I've seen two. One of them was Wild Wild Country, which is about a cult out of Oregon in the 80s. And I saw that because a friend had recommended me because she's from Oregon and her family was impacted by these events that had gone down in the 80s. So there was that like personal connection, right? Because it's real life. And also the other one, it's called Sister's Keeper. I started watching that because it's based in Maryland, which is like where my parents are, and I had gone to school in Maryland, and the crime had happened at a school that's in the same county where I had gone to school. And so I think true crime also has these it's possible to form these personal connections to the events that are going on, which might also increase viewership. And so, yeah, the veracity bit does a lot when it comes to explaining the appeal.
Yeah, right. And with your first point of, this is a thing that could have happened to me, right? You could sort of project yourself into the position of, the victim or the survivor, if they did survive. And often they didn't in these stories. And I think that's an important part of them. But there's also the fact that you could potentially bump into some of these people that are in, talking heads in the series or people, that are described or talked about in the series, right? That especially when they're still alive, you could literally run into them in a way that you could not run into Sherlock Holmes or, Tom Cruise's character in Top Gun, right? That you could run into Tom Cruise, but you can't run into his character.
Right.
And so I think that that's important. That these people are out there in the world, and that matters to people who consume and enjoy these things, that it matters that they're out there, right? And it's a way of, as you said, maybe you could sort of have personal connections to them in a way that may seem more meaningful than the personal connections you have to fictional characters, although that may be true for some people, but other people I think form really deep and lasting personal connections to characters of fiction. And that's an ordinary aspect of why people read and enjoy, or watch and enjoy works of fiction.
Right. Yeah. And that's another big question in philosophy of fiction, of trying to understand these like real, genuine emotions we feel towards characters and events, and what's going on, and are there normative constraints to that or not? Right. So I think that's really fascinating. Talking about potentially running into these people reminded me of a really wild story I heard from a family friend. So she apparently, God, it's so awful. She apparently worked with Jeffrey Dahmer in the same office. And so one day he offered her a ride and she took it. And so, just kind of like quiet office guy. I guess they were going to the same place. And so she gets in the car in the front seat next to him. And she said the car smelled funky. And so she like made a comment to him like, hey, did you did you leave food here? Like, is something going on? And he was like, oh yeah, don't worry about it. I like left a sandwich in the back seat too long. And then so later on, when like news came out and she found out, she said she like obviously flipped out because of what we know about him. And anyway, that was like a really wild story of like, ooh, could have been a close call for this friend, but like stuff like that, right? Like really kind of changes the way you consume true crime, I think, because there's that added edge of could have been me. I mean, I almost wonder if it invites people to like play detective, right? Like this could have been happening, this could be happening now, like elsewhere, or like if I knew what the detectives knew, like what would I have done? And so this like almost invitation to puzzle solve, like watching a mystery show or movie. So
Yeah, and I think the form of true crime also invites you to play detective, right? The order in which they present information, right, is they're holding off for the big reveal in the final episode. And so this whole time you are very much like thinking about the clues that they're giving you, and you're sort of working through and processing it, and you do get to play detective. And so it does have a, as you said, it has a form of like a traditional like detective novel uh in a way, and especially when they're a series, right, where it's a number of episodes that sort of function like chapters in a novel, right, so it does have this literary form it sort of imposed on these real world events, which you described before, that the postmodern take is that it doesn't matter because you're just imposing a narrative structure that didn't really exist in reality. And of course, that's how, in the Poetics, Aristotle distinguishes history from tragedy, right? Is that tragedy has a narrative form, whereas history does not, right? When in fact, maybe that's how history was practiced when Aristotle was writing about it, but who would want to read it? It was just like this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened, right? It needs this narrative form that this happened, therefore this happened, but then this other thing intervened, therefore this, right? Which is a traditional narrative structure imported from fiction.
right. And so, yeah, Chronicles was just this happened, this happened, this happened. It's not fun to read, right? And so, yeah, I mean, you're reminding me of this conflation that I think is often made in the literature and just in public at large, one between narrative and fiction. So, I mean, especially the way we use the word, the English word fiction, we usually mean like prose or like novel, right? Like we think fiction and novel are like synonymous, such that when we talk about stories, that also kind of seems partly synonymous with fiction. And I think that's a mistake because narrative is just a way of storytelling, like you said, it's a way you structure something. And so I could tell you a narrative about my life, that's totally all true. But just because it's narrative and has this form doesn't mean it's fiction, right? It's still nonfiction. And that's why history is still nonfiction, even though it might have some narrative things. And so that's just to say not all narratives are fiction. And so there are these really great stories, true crime included, that are nonfiction. But I think it goes the other way as well, where I think there are works of fiction that are not stories. And so this is more contentious and is, some of the research I'm working on, but I think paintings can totally be fiction. And so think about like Escher paintings where you have these impossible staircases or impossible waterfalls. I think that is a snapshot of a fictional state of affairs. It's an impossible, waterfall or architecture that's inviting you to imagine it or do something else with it. But I think it's squarely in the fiction case. Walton writes about whether music can be approached with like a fictional framework. And so I think it'd be really neat if we can start kind of systematically investigating ways in which fiction can take the form of something other than narratives. So that's my little spiel about the fiction narrative distinction.
Yeah, and this is a digression, so forgive me. But as you're talking, it sort of reminded me that we're talking about true crime, which is a form of nonfiction that has a lot of the trappings that are more traditional to fiction, right? But the opposite can be the case also, where mockumentaries, which are works of fiction that have the form of traditional documentaries. And so the seminal one being This Is Spinal Tap, but then, nearly every Christopher Guest film, Waiting for Guffman, A Mighty Wind, Best in Show, et cetera. The Office, both UK and US versions, Parks and Rec, right? These are works of fiction that have, at least visual grammar and storytelling grammar or form of documentaries, right? And so I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. We're talking true crime, which is the opposite direction, but
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a really interesting point. I mean, it reminds me of like early novels. So think about Moby Dick, Robinson Crusoe, Scarlet Letter. All of these works of fiction were like mockumentary in the sense that they tried to come off as a work of nonfiction. So Daniel Defoe got in a lot of trouble for trying to pass off Crusoe as like a true thing, as like a sailor who was stranded. And when people called him out, they were like, there's no way this is true. He was like, okay, sorry, like it's not technically true, but all the truths about the human condition and the religious truths are really true. So it's still like, like true and not merely fiction. And so I don't know. I wondered whether there's something going on at this period of time of writing where people are nervous about just making stuff up and like making it clear that the content is totally imaginary. And so Catherine Gallagher, who's a literary scholar, says it's because they're like insecure about this new form and the status that it has. Because for a long time, fiction was synonymous with like fanciful, almost like silly, like nearly like a lie, right? And so Hume, I think, uses the word fiction to mean the same thing as like mistake or lie. If something's fictitious, it's not true. And so we saw that with Moby Dick, where like, oh my gosh, so much like nonfiction going on about like whale parts, right? And the whaling industry. Same thing with like Scarlet Letter, where it's told as if some dude came across like court documents and stories, and like he's recounting some history that he found. And so there was this real desire to like come off as nonfiction, even though the author knew they were creating a work of fiction. That kind of went out of vogue, right? Because like now, centuries later, we're more comfortable with like taking in fiction as fiction. We even play with metafictionality, right? We're like in Unamuno, The Mist, we get characters who come to the author and ask that they not be killed. And there are these like really interesting stuff going on. But then are we going back to the original cycle with mockumentaries of, I mean, I guess fashion was cyclical even in the fiction world, where, yeah, kind of going back to that style. And that's a really interesting trend, right? That we do that.
yeah, and with mockumentaries too, it was, when This Is Spinal Tap came out in the late 70s, I think maybe 1980, it's right around there. No one had seen anything like that before, a work of fiction that had this documentary form. And so most original viewers or initial viewers thought it was a documentary. And they're like, why would anyone make a documentary about this loser band we've never heard of? Right. And so they didn't get that it was meant as entertainment, because documentary signaled not entertainment, but something that you're meant to learn something from, that's supposed to be about the world in some way. And so that's interesting that, novels that tried to pass themselves off in some way as nonfiction sort of had this response of, there's no way this is real, or, ooh, this is real, right? And then with Spinal Tap, it had the opposite effect, right? Of, oh, this is supposed to be real, this is boring, right? And then once you get its entertainment, once you're sort of keyed into that, and now we have enough mockumentaries and enough works of fiction in the style that we just get it immediately. There's no confusion of whether the characters on The Office are real people that we could bump into if we were to happen to go to Scranton or something of that sort.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, it makes me wonder how much of these framing devices about controlling expectations. So, when mockumentaries were new, because the expectations were unclear, people got confused. And I'm sure similar stories could be told of like the earlier novels too, where just people didn't know what to expect. And right, that's why the form had to be one of history or like autobiography. Um, so yeah, I mean, I do wonder sometimes whether the fiction nonfiction distinction is more about expectation setting, whether it's about the readers or legally or whatever, than the content per se.
Yeah, good. So I want to finish on something we've touched on already, which is why people enjoy true crime as a genre, right? What is it that people are getting out of this? And we've talked about a couple of things already. One being that we could bump into these people. Another being we could project ourselves into it. Another being that we're sort of put in the role of detective, and so we could sort of vicariously do detective work, similar to watching an episode of CSI or something of that sort, except these are real events, right? But what are some other reasons you think that people seek out and consume and enjoy this genre?
Yeah. Two things come to mind. One is just, I think we just as a species like can't look away from a train wreck. Or like there's some fascination we have that's so deep rooted about um things that are just not right or abnormal or catastrophes. So think about like psychology, right? For so long we just focused on abnormal psychology and what happens when the mind just goes horrifically wrong, right? And like positive psychology was has to do with in what situations does the mind thrive. That's a pretty new discipline that had to take really intentional like reframing. And so it's just one example of like we really like the dark stuff when it comes to humanity. And so I wonder if true crime is like one way of indulging that like weird fascination with the dark, messed up aspect of humanity. And I guess related to that, the second point was I think true crime lets the writers or the creators like push the boundary on like how far you can get the viewer to sympathize or empathize with the protagonist, even though they're doing really horrific things. And so, an example that comes to mind is like Breaking Bad, which is just fictional, right? But I've been told, like, and I haven't seen the show, but from what I've heard, super morally ambiguous protagonist, and people are kind of horrified that they're rooting for this guy, right? And so, just imagine that, but based on real events like true crime. I know Ted Bundy was like really popular too, and which is weird. Like we like root for these people that we know to have done really horrific things, and like from an artistic point of view, like put morality aside, it's really interesting that you can get readers to do that, maybe just in virtue of them being the main character and protagonist. I'm sure it doesn't hurt having Zac Efron play the character, but it really kind of asks these questions of how far can you stretch the moral reaction or even moral imagination, such that people feel in ways that might not line up with how they feel towards real life situations. And so I imagine that's like an artistically really interesting project to have. And so true crime lets creators do that, really push the boundaries on these issues. And I think that might be another reason why true crime is popular, that they get to do this like unlikely perpetrator sympathizing emotional work.
Yeah, I mean, so Anne Eaton's work on rough heroes, right, in the context of fiction, where Walter White from Breaking Bad is an example of a rough hero, right? It's someone who's doing morally ambiguous, if not outright immoral things, and yet it's an achievement of the work that we still root for them in some way, or at least the very least we sympathize or empathize with them, that's an aesthetic achievement, even though it may be a moral failing perhaps, but we're exporting that idea to nonfiction, right? That seems more nebulous, right? It may be, at least on its face, right? And I'm sure I could be argued out of this. Maybe, I don't know. But it seems more problematic when we're dealing with real people who have done real things, as opposed to Walter White, who's a fictional character, Hannibal Lecter, who's a fictional character, but Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, these are real people who did real things to real people, whose families, members of their family, friends, we could potentially bump into on the street, right? And coming to empathize with these people, that seems more troubling of an aesthetic achievement than in the case of fiction, where we're just not going to run into these people. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that? And maybe that's where we'll end on that
Yeah.
dark note.
Um, yeah, I mean, I agree that it is more troubling. I was thinking that I could totally imagine it being the case that like we're just not very consistent remembers when it comes to like consuming things. And I think it might even just give more weight to the idea that imagination per se is neutral between the fiction nonfiction distinction. So for instance, like when we're trying to justify to ourselves why we want to watch true crime and not just total fiction, like we might say, oh, this is based on true facts. It's like half educational, right? Like then it's really salient in the forefront of our mind that this is nonfiction and true. But when we're actually engaging with the characters and like seeing them do what they do and like they're running away from the police, then I'm like, no, don't get caught. Like at that moment, it's far like in the back of my mind that this is a real person who really did these things, because it's kind of watching like a mafia movie and like rooting for the mafias, right? It's so similar in structure that like it won over my allegiance already. And it doesn't matter whether it's fiction or nonfiction at this point. I still just care. And so I think like, yeah, that selective like paying attention to whether it's fiction or nonfiction might explain why this happens. Doesn't explain that it's okay. And I'm just drawing this connection to like, how do you separate these from propaganda or like, representations that fuel disinformation or fake news? And so I've actually been reading about like North Korean art and the way they use literature and like painting to, propagate their version of like what really is going on. And I'm like, oof, like there's some like similarities to be drawn. And I guess we are ending on a dark note, I guess, but yeah, no, really philosophically rich, and yeah, it's all really interesting stuff.
Awesome. Well, Hannah, on that dark note, thank you so much for joining me. This is really fun.
Thank you.